Hello and welcome to the ThinkFwd. My name is Spencer Burke, your host for ThinkFwd. In this week's episode, I sit down with Butler Bass and we talk about her latest book, A People's History of Christianity. There are amazing stories in this book that you may not read in regular textbooks. Stories of inspiration and hope. So I encourage you to pick up the book as well as watch the show. And also, as we are now in our 10th show, I'd encourage you to pass on these stories to people who might not normally see them. The way that you could do it is head over to the ThinkFwd, email it, make a comment, download the small group questions, or even embed this player on your website or on your blog. I hope you enjoy this week's episode here on the ThinkFwd.
What I was interested in is the idea that a lot of people right now seem to have lost their memory about the history of Christianity. And when memory gets lost, it becomes dangerous because other people will fill in with negative stories or stories in which they're trying to control other people. So what I wanted to do was walk into the room of historical storytellers and try to tell a tale about the history of Christianity that is open and inclusive and about the love of God and love of neighbor, rather than the typical stories we hear about violence or institutional control or orthodoxy or whatever those stories happen to be. What people typically say about the history of Christianity, and I called it Big C Christianity. The big C's are Christ, Constantine, Christendom, the Crusades, Calvin, and a Christian America. And if you tell the story of the history of faith, it's typically with that as its narrative arc. And that's a story, and it certainly is true, but it is also a kind of what I would call manifest destiny form of the faith. And so what I tried to develop was a different narrative arc. And instead of using the big C's, I used the great command, love God and love your neighbor as yourself, as the narrative flow for which to tell my history of Christianity.
Now, and you also introduce us to some people that might not be on everyone's radar when they think about history. Play with a couple of them.
Well, that's always a problem whenever you write history, especially history that takes up 2,000 years and you're supposed to write it only in 300 pages, is who do you include? And I really struggle with this with my editor. So in this book, there are some people that everyone would have heard about. And I do talk about Calvin and Luther and Thomas Aquinas, some pretty big names. But then I also talk about lesser known names like Perpetua, who was an early Christian martyr, or I think many people know of Hildegard of Bingen now, maybe have heard her name, but aren't very familiar with what she's about. So the sort of mid-level recognition of people in history. But then there are some people that are completely off the radar screen. The Reverend Samuel Green, a Methodist minister in the 1850s in Maryland, for example, born in slavery, and had a very dramatic story of his quest for freedom based on his sense of freedom in the gospel. And so I tried to tell those stories as well.
Anything that kind of, as the books come out, that you've been awakened to, or kind of thought, like, oh wow, I hadn't thought of that. It's like as it continues to write itself, you know?
Oh, yeah, there are a couple things. I have been reading a manuscript of a book that's not yet out by Harvey Cox, interestingly enough. It comes out in the fall. And he looks at much of the same kind of trajectory that I'm looking at this book. And he talks about how most history that has been written in the past has been written by winners, and he tries to pick up some things that were excluded. And he talks quite a bit about like the Gospel of Thomas, and he also talks about a martyr whose name slightly escapes me now. I think his name was Priscillianus, and it was about the year 385, and he was from Spain. And he was actually the first ever Christian who was killed by other Christians. And so Cox talks about that as a really important moment in the history of Christianity. Until then, the empire killed Christians.
Right.
But at that moment, Christians began killing Christians. And in a very real way, that's where that negative story starts kicking in.
So often people refer to understanding the past is really the window into the future.
Yeah.
So
I was listening to the Joe Scarborough show, Morning Joe, a couple weeks ago, and John Meacham was on. And I love John Meacham. He's an Episcopalian, like I am. He would love this setting. And he's the editor of Newsweek, and he just won the Pulitzer Prize in biography for his wonderful book on Andrew Jackson. And when Joe Scarborough was interviewing him, Joe said, well, why, you're a news guy. Why are you writing history? And John said, well, history is to a country what memory is to an individual. And as soon as that came out of his mouth, I just thought to myself that that's really it. History is to a denomination. History is to a congregation. History is to a spiritual community. History is to a tradition. What memory is to us as individuals. And if we put it in that frame, one of the things that I think sort of pops, for me at least, is that loss of memory isn't funny. That loss of memory, if you've ever dealt with anybody who has Alzheimer's, it's a tragedy. And it's fatal. And as soon as we lose memory, we stop knowing who we are. And we have not only no past, but we disconnect from ourselves here now. And there's no future for us. And so I think that history plays exactly that role for us, is that it's about time. And time is not just what happened, but time is what is happening, and time is what will happen. And so I think the three things, those three phases of history are so beautifully woven together. It's such a mystery, but it's also a mystery that we as human beings long to participate in and unpack and have some sense of deeper understanding of ourselves and our world.
Our history is rich. Our resources are rich. But there are other things that are lacking that can actually create fear for those who don't want to let go.
Well, nostalgia and history are two different things.
Okay, excellent.
And when people mix them up, then you can start getting into some trouble. Because nostalgia is a view of history through rose-colored glasses. Real history is a sense of honesty about the past. And that includes both the good and bad parts of the past. I actually think that part of the problem with Christianity right now is we've forgotten the good parts of the past. And that's what I was trying to do in this book, trying to fill in some of the good parts. Nostalgia is taking only the good part of the story at the expense of the bad part of the story, and refusing to look at it. And so what I think has to happen in any community and in our own lives is we have to be able to look at the past and understand it in its fullness. And that's what history is. And when you get that grounded fullness, you can't fall into nostalgia.
This moment in time, any words of wisdom for those who are watching this and thinking, wow,
I think it's a great time. We could have been born in some really boring time. There have been plenty of really boring times in history, but this is not that. This is not a status quo time. This is not a business as usual time. It's not a maintenance time. This is a time for creativity. This is a time for openness. This is a time for all of our imaginations. If we let the universe teach us, we'll understand that this is a moment that is calling forth the best in us. And to me, that's one of the things that gives me hope. It doesn't have to be the way it's been. There's a lot for us to do, and there is wisdom from which we can do it.
I'm looking forward to journeying with you as we go.
Oh, thank you, Spencer.
All right, it's exciting.